If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. On the back of the Alexander the Great podcast, there's been lots and lots of questions that have come in about greatness, which has left me pondering the word great. I've always wondered about greatness. What is it? And more importantly, why aren't people great anymore? You just don't hear of it, do you? The idea of somebody being great isn't actually a natural thing. It's something that's bred under very specific cultural circumstances. And the idea that someone could actually be great is actually a Persian idea, the great king. So he's the king of kings, and that's how he's known. The king of Persia was superior, and the Persian Empire is, well, quite simply, it's the greatest empire that has ever been. And ultimately, when you think of history, certainly when I think of history, everything leads back to Persia. So the king of Persia is the great king. Then Alexander III of Macedon, of Greece, conquers the Persian Empire. So then he becomes the great king in the 4th century BC. He dies and his empire splits up and his generals all kind of scavenge over it like a pack of hyenas, trying to be the next Alexander. And there is one king in particular called Antiochus, and he was one of Alexander's generals who goes back into Persia to reconquer it. And he actually adopts the name of Great. He's calling himself the Great King. And there is a hint there that this is where it all begins. This is the nucleus of when the Great actually starts. But then what happens is that the Romans pick up on it. And if you listen to my podcast that I did on Alexander the Great, you'll get more detail on how that actually happens. But the first reference to Alexander is in the mid-3rd century BC. And they start calling him Alexander Magnus, Alexander the Great. So what I'm basically saying is that the idea of greatness actually comes from ancient history. And I think what's really interesting about that is that ancient historians will boast that they have lots of great people. I know. But of course, in modern history, there really aren't that many great people. But I happened to find 17 greats when I started this research. It's very precise. There could be more, there could be less, and it's a little bit subjective. I mean, the most recent is the modern Emperor Meiji of Japan, and he actually dies in 1912. He's the guy that actually opens up Japan to the West, and he modernizes Japan. He pushes it, screaming into the 20th century because there was a lot of resistance for Japan to do that. A lot of people there really didn't want that to happen. But everybody before that, I mean, think about this. The last people who I think of as great are probably Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. So, then we're talking about the beginning of the 18th century. And then I wondered why Winston Churchill wasn't great, because he's widely celebrated as one of history's most influential leaders, primarily due to his role as British Prime Minister during World War II. He was an amazing orator, and his contributions to, shaping the post-World War period were paramount. And I suppose the title The Great is often associated with, monarchs or rulers who achieved monumental kind of conquests or founded empires or enacted significant reforms in pre-modern history. Churchill as a modern politician in a democratic system doesn't actually fit that traditional mold. But he is honored. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, and he was actually named the greatest Briton in a BBC poll that took place in 2002. And of course, you can't forget the state funeral that Queen Elizabeth I gave him in 1965. And surely all of that makes him great. And of course, then you think about figures like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi. Weren't they also great? Then, of course, if you dig deep enough, you've got the enlightened despots. I mean, I found them excruciatingly boring when I did them at A level. Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great. Oh my gosh. It was all I could do to stop from falling asleep during exams. And of course, these were people who modernized Russia and Prussia, the Central European monarchies. But I mean, who is deciding that they are great? Is there a greatness selection committee sitting somewhere? I mean, is there? There isn't. It emerges from the immediate historiography. They are the creation of Victorian writers. And I think that greatness, when we talk about people being great, a lot of it has to do with nation building, state builders. And I think it's a thing that Victorians did. I mean, as you know, Victorians or 19th century nationalists generally were all about finding historical roots of nation states and arguing that they would delve back into the archives to prove that a given nation had been, I guess, born unsullied and pure at the dawn of history. And I think they actually looked for founding fathers. I mean, Catherine the Great obviously is a woman, but by and large, all the greats have been men. They were warriors, they welded people into this sort of mighty realm, or they modernized it. But then I wondered why George Washington is not George the Great, because he is, in the essence, a founding father. And I then wondered, is it because he founded a republic? But you do get great men in republics, you do. But that being said, the Americans don't use that terminology. But they do use the term the founding fathers. And they, of course, have the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Monument. I mean, you can go to Monticello and, Thomas Jefferson's house and do homage, to that great man. You can do that. But these men are not known as Jefferson the Great or, George the Great. And I think what that means is that there is an issue with greatness in republics and calling someone great. And of course, then the question begs, is there anyone who is called great who isn't actually a monarch? Well, there is actually. There's Pompey the Great, and there are some earls and some bishops, some lesser earls and lesser bishops. But apart from them, they are all monarchs. Then, isn't it true by definition in a democracy that you can't have a great? Because you'd think that the majority of the people would have voted other candidates or voted for other candidates. They would have voted against them. And also, it's an offense against the very idea of the democratic idea, isn't it? The egalitarianism of a republic or a democracy, that there are great people, great men who put democracies in their shadow, is actually seen as being threatening. But democracies have great men. They just don't call them great. Then again, what about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk or Father Turk, the founder of modern Turkey? So there's a man effectively, he is another founding father who is kind of sticking it all together. And I would argue that he is a 20th century example of someone who was actually great. And of course, in Ireland, there's Aemon de Valera. But of course, he's not known as Aemon the Great. And I think that quote, the idea of great men who power history forwards, that's actually from Thomas Carlyle, the great Victorian biographer, who was very keen on men powering those ideas forward. And Carlyle was one of Hitler's favorite authors. So Hitler, in the bunker, by his bed, had Carlyle's biography of Frederick the Great, who is seen as great because it looks like Prussia is going to be crushed by its enemies that are completely surrounding it, and he manages to break free. So when Roosevelt died just before the end of the Second World War, Goebbels, Hitler's director of mass entertainment, he and Hitler have this conversation. And what they say is, the situation that we're in now, this is what just happened to Frederick the Great. History is repeating itself. His enemies died just as he was about to be beaten. And we are just like Frederick the Great, and we are going to wriggle free and we're going to win. And of course, there is a shadow hanging over Frederick, who raises Prussia up from being a kind of a backward no-hoper of a power to, come on, let's be fair, it's true, to be one of the great powers of Europe. And essentially, the stepping stone to what becomes united Germany in the 19th century. And of course, anything that Hitler likes is obviously bad, and it becomes problematic. So the sense that the fascists identified with that idea of greatness is bad. But that being said, lots of people identify with greatness, don't they? I mean, we all did at one stage. Children reading history books identify with greatness because they see themselves as the hero. And it's one of the reasons why books by authors like Wilbur Smith, as an example, become so popular, because he talks about some of the greats in his books. He mentions Cecil Rhodes, Shaka Zulu, Richard Francis Burton, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, Nelson Mandela. They're all in Wilbur Smith's books. And it's safe to read these books as a kid, but maybe not safe to read books about guys like Pol Pot, who actually called himself great, but he clearly wasn't, or Mao, who clearly wasn't either. If you're a fascist, then you believe in great men shaping destiny. So it's fine for Hitler and Mussolini to broadcast themselves as being great. Stalin and Mao are just as influential figures, but they see themselves as the expression of the will of the people, and that's the difference. So even though Mao is the great helmsman, or whatever he called himself, you can't talk in that sense of greatness that is associated with monarchs. Stalin's iconography was all about being a great man. I mean, the images of him as the father of his people, just like Hitler, and just like Hitler, he would get love letters from ordinary Russian women. He was sort of projected as this colossus, larger than life, supremely wise and great military leader, and all that kind of stuff. But officially, Stalin is the expression of the will of the people. That's what he's about. Marxism is actually founded on the idea that individuals, great people, are just surface froth. It's true. But what matters are the great tides of economic history, of class warfare, because that is really what determines history. And so any notion that great individuals shape history is actually a delusion. But I think that ideology, there's a problem for communists with talking about great people. I mean, we've all seen those kind of Red Square parades where you have Lenin, kind of mummified like a pharaoh. I mean, isn't this interesting? So Lenin's body mummified right now in Red Square, that's actually Alexander the Great all over again. I mean, I just finished 2 podcasts on Alexander, and here's the similarities. His body was actually kidnapped after he died, and it was taken to Alexandria as a sort of badge of authenticity for the Ptolemies, the dynasty that ended up taking over Egypt, which is basically what Lenin's successors did with his body, and it's still there today. And all that you're missing there are the words, the great. I think what it suggests is that there is a kind of inherent desire on humans to kind of acknowledge and, I guess, indecently prostrate yourselves, before the idea of greatness. But that in the modern world is in conflict with a reluctance to express it. And that's part of republics, part of democracies, and it's definitely part of communist states. But what's so interesting is, so in the modern world, the people who believe in greatness tend to be, should we say, pas de corps, than people who don't. But even, you're high-minded, I don't know, you're Guardian reading vegan. And for American listeners, that would be the New York Times, or if you're a Canadian, the Globe and Mail, believes implicitly in greatness, don't they? Because you must question, well, I mean, Nelson Mandela, is he not great? Is he not this inspirational figure who transcended his times? And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Altidomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. And of course, in America, they have Martin Luther King Day, and that is a kind of different expression of what greatness is. And that, I guess, would be moral greatness. But it's not just moral greatness, is it? It's surfing the tide of history, the arc of justice. And I have to say that I also think that Barack Obama will be in that box one day. Mark my words, he will. But I guess there is a kind of qualitative difference there because Mandela is seen as being great because he's seen as morally great. And it's the same with Gandhi. And it's not a greatness in the Alexander the Great mold. But if you're a child, say 1,000 years ago, wouldn't you be taught that these great figures were people to emulate, that they had the moral qualities as well as martial qualities? I mean, Alexander the Great had courage, for instance. And I think that's really interesting because actually 1,000 years ago, if you were in Europe, you would have had a very Christian perspective on this. And I think there is a deep ambivalence in monasteries, for instance, about things. Alexander the Great is definitely there. And there are hints in the sources that there were monks who felt that Alfred was perhaps a little bit too pushy, but equally there were reasons why monks subsequently are able to define Alfred as great because he's seen as having been a great patron of the church. But there is a definitively Christian ambivalence towards figures like Alexander, who, while pagan, who are definitely seen as being steeped in blood. The idea that martial greatness is the definition of greatness, I think he's a kind of legacy of the kind of ambivalent Christian attitudes towards greatness that we've actually inherited. So here's somebody who was definitely inspired by martial greatness, and I mentioned him, briefly at the start of this podcast, Churchill. Now, Churchill, I could do 1 billion podcasts on and not exhaust what I want to say, nor do I think it would dampen public enthusiasm for that man. But is he great? I mean, I would say he's flawed, but I mean, everybody's flawed because we're human. And I would say it's ludicrous to say he's not a great figure who, has become an icon, has become a symbol of the nation who, and actually all the flaws are actually part of his greatness because everybody we've talked about has been flawed. And I think the way that people have been reacting to Churchill recently highlights the way in which the meaningness of great has actually evolved, I think. So I think Churchill is great in the classical sense of greatness. He is a great man who, in an hour of crisis, saves his country. And there is something very Greek about that, isn't there? He is great because although he's personally flawed, those flaws actually only served to emphasize the scale of everything he achieved in rallying and saving his country and much, much more. And I think that people thought that at the time as well. He is the British lion personified. And I think that one of the reasons why his statue keeps getting attacked now is that the sense of greatness has actually evolved and become what I was saying about Mandela or, Martin Luther King, that for greatness, you have to be morally great. And I think that there is a feeling that Churchill, on the measurement of greatness, doesn't quite measure up because he's seen to have racist views. And, I mentioned the arc of history. He's seen as someone who's on the wrong side of a lot of issues. And even by the standards at the time, he was seen as being a massive reactionary. And the fact that people are kind of dubbing racist, slurs on his statue, I think is actually proof of his greatness. Because if you weren't great, who would care? It's an attack not just on Churchill, but on an understanding of greatness that's now very, very contested. And I just have to take a wee drink because I've got a bit of a scratchy throat. I woke up with it this morning and I decided to do some research and devise a concoction where you slice onions and put them into a jar, you cover them with honey, you then leave it for half an hour, and then you drink it. And it's supposed to cure all ills. I will keep you posted. Let me just have a sip of this. Oh my gosh. That's an interesting taste. Okay, back to what I was saying about greatness and how I think it's now being very, very contested. I think that it kind of blurs in with the fact that the main island in the UK is also called Great Britain. And that has nothing to do with the fact that Britain objectively is great. It's the fact that the island of Britain is bigger than Little Britain, which is actually Brittany. So that's why it's Great Britain, just in case you were wondering. It's actually being expressed as its geographical size. But I think that obviously, kind of over Britain's imperial heyday, there was a tendency to say, we're great. We live in Great Britain, so we must be great. So kind of normative determinism. And I think that Churchill is the kind of archetypal poster boy for that idea of Britain being great. And so I think that also is something that is being attacked, because part of what's at the back of the minds of people who see Churchill as a kind of problematic emblem for Britain is the sense that his model of greatness is something that is essentially to be rejected. It's militarist and it's supremacist. But again, you know what? That feeds into the idea that we're talking about a model of greatness, an idea of greatness that feels a little bit old-fashioned. I mean, I think if you're Chinese, Xi Jinping, will he be great one day? But again, this is the communist thing. He can't be enshrined as a great man the way that the Chinese emperors were, the first emperor. I mean, China obviously has always had a kind of sense of the great man because it's actually born with it. The first emperor is seen as very much in the style that we've been talking about. The guy who actually creates a state, who fashions an empire, fashions an order. And that inheritance runs right the way down to the abolition of the figure of the emperor in the early 20th century. But obviously Mao and Deng, there is a sense in which the figure of the emperor is someone who's absent, that it's kind of like losing a limb or something. But China is officially a communist state. And so I think ideologically, there is a place for greatness in that kind of Thomas Carlyle kind of way. I mean, the great helmsman Mao, all those people waving their little red books, but there is a tension there. The Chinese cannot celebrate Mao as great in the way that the Germans celebrated, Hitler as great, or even, and I guarantee you that you would never get a Chinese general secretary behaving the way Trump behaved when he returned to office. But Putin, different story. Putin would have behaved the way that Trump behaved. And what he might have done is even taken his top off because he's done this before. And actually, the way Trump behaves with, MAGA just shows you how greatness is actually embedded in the American political psyche. I mean, the iconography of the president is all about the great man, and it always has been. And that kind of feeds back to what I've talked about on other podcasts about the relationship between Rome as a republic and America as a republic. I think a massive part of what makes Americans very, very uncomfortable about Trump is the sense that he is pushing that model of greatness too far. When I started researching this, being a historian, the idea of greatness was anathema because the very idea of greatness to most historians, especially academic historians, it's absolutely complete nonsense and unthinkable. And I've been in debates when someone says, so-and-so is great, and I would usually just scoff. But then later, you'd be having a drink at the pub or you'd be, having a drink at the bar and talking about whether Pele was the greatest footballer ever. So that begs the question, can you measure greatness in sport and not in history? I mean, Muhammad Ali famously said, "I am the greatest." And then he actually created his own myth, which is what great men and women do to an extent, right? But the appeal of sport is that it provides a stage where hero worship can be channeled very safely. But then You would argue that history is no different. But history also suggests that giving a stage to people who see themselves as great and who are seen by other people as great can actually threaten disaster, especially if you live in a democracy or a republic. And I think if you walk into a good bookshop and you go to the history section, you'll see inspiring books about, Amelia Earhart and Marie Curie and Agatha Christie and Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks is actually somebody who's clearly conceived by lots of people as a great, great figure. But for someone like her, I don't think the word great is actually adequate enough. I don't think she's the model of greatness as is traditionally understood. She has an incredible moral quality that allowed her to be at the right side of history, to transcend time, to lead her people, to be the vessel, or something much bigger than actually herself. But again, this goes back to the sense in which, if we're going to talk about people like that as being great, it's because we're talking about moral greatness. So is there a distinction between martial greatness and moral greatness? And I think it's because we're uncomfortable with the word saint. And I think it's all due to the fact that we're actually uncomfortable with the word saint. But I think that actually someone like Mandela, the emotions that he inspires, the emotions that traditionally saints have inspired, they're kind of secular saints. And I think it's different. People visit their shrines, they get relics, and also they are seen as kind of morally inspirational. And that if you behave like them, then, you will make the world a better place. You'll make the right decisions. And I think that's actually a key part of it. Whereas if you behave like Elon Musk, you become laughable and pitied. And that's not the face anyone wants for themselves. I think in the West, everything comes down to Christianity, and we remain sufficiently Christian that we're uncomfortable with the idea of great men and women because we recognize that there is actually an aspect of that greatness that is almost kind of pagan. Almost. It's kind of a classical idea that morally we're uncomfortable with it, but we're insufficiently Christian that we're now happy to talk about saints. So let's bring this forward. Since the Alexander podcast, people have written to me asking that I pick 3 people who I think are great. And the caveat was with the questions that they have to be alive right now. The problem is, I don't think this is an age where people are great. I mean, Trump and Musk, I think they're going to want to be called great, but that's never going to happen. And, populist leaders would like to think of themselves as being called the great, but not those two. But I'll tell you someone who I think may be remembered as the great and who may be called the great. And I think it's Putin. And the reason for that is that I think that Putin is creating his own reality. Putin is actually creating a kind of model of Russian history in which great men do step forward and follow in the footsteps of their previous great leaders, leaders who came way before. So not Stalin, of course, but the likes of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great particularly. And so I think, Catherine the Great, she reconquers Crimea, which is exactly what Putin has done. So maybe history will call him Vladimir the Great. And I can almost buy into future historians doing that. And look, I'm no fan. I have to emphasize that. But clearly, let's say he does another 10 years and then goes and people say he's transformed his country, he's made it strong. At that stage, he may be respected on the world stage. And I think the Russians will bow down before his image for decades to come. And I think that he will be called the Great. If anyone's going to be called the Great in Russia, certainly not in the Ukraine or Poland or Germany, but in Russia, it'll be Putin. So we spoke of saints, and I think that Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, I think they're possibly in that realm. I mean, there's definitely going to be children's books written about them for sure. The British stage, as an example, is too small, too disputed for anyone to emerge from there. And of course, I mean, we have Macron in France. Clearly, he has aspirations to be Napoleon. But Napoleon is actually the archetype of the great man whose shadow hangs over the whole of the 19th century. And so every French leader has that. If France is great, then de Gaulle has to be the great man. And I think Macron could possibly be part of that tradition. But actually, the person who I haven't talked about, who I think was the most powerful and the most respected leader, certainly the most respected leader in the Western world, is Angela Merkel. Even now. Angela the Great? You know what? I love that idea. But the whole point of Merkel is that she's kind of anonymous. And that's why greatness is her calling card. Competence is actually what she's all about. Of course, the one mistake that Germans would argue was opening up her borders, and that's where the arc of history comes in and closes it, isn't it? But that actually makes her greater to me. Saint Angela, maybe? She has a claim on that meaning of the word great, but certainly not in any sense a claim on the kind of Frederick the Great model. She's better than that. So, on that happy note, folks, thanks for sitting with me through this lively, interesting discussion. It's been kind of fun. Sorry about the throat. I am about to dip back into my concoction, so hopefully I'll be on the mend by next week. Thanks again, guys. Bye for now.